Et åpenbart skritt inn I framtiden jo selvsagt utdanningen. And I'll switch to English for the benefit of our distinguished guests from across the Atlantic. Zero-emission buildings has also been involved in education, for example, through the Master in Sustainable Architecture offered here at NTNU in Trondheim, and through several collaborative teaching projects in Norway and internationally. And here to present some of the results of these collaborations is Tom Collins. Tom Collins is Assistant Professor of Architecture at Ball State University in Indiana, USA, where he teaches design and environmental systems. He has also taught architecture at Boston Architectural College at the University of Oregon, as well as at Ball State. And his research focuses on energy, building performance, and human behavior. Tom Collins.
Thank you. I'll be the token English presentation for today, I guess. But thank you for having me here today. I'm going to talk today a little bit about a teaching experience that applied the ZEB concept and ZEB principles to the teaching of an architecture design studio a couple of years ago at the University of Oregon. So just again to give you a little bit of background here. In 2015, the spring semester of 2015, Tina Hegley, who was up here just a few minutes ago, was invited to be visiting teaching fellow at the University of Oregon. And part of her task for that semester was to teach a design studio. Tina had never taught a design studio before, but she was really excited about it. And my boss at the time, I was finishing my PhD in sustainable architecture that term. And my boss said to me, how would you feel about teaching a studio with Tina? And I said, that sounds great. And she said, it's going to be about some of the work that Tina's been doing with zero-emission buildings. And I thought, okay, I don't really know what kind of work Tina's been doing with zero-emission buildings, but okay. And so that's how we sort of got started. This was a 10-week project. There were 2 instructors. Tina would come for periods of time, and I was there for the whole time. We had 16 students, and the project was focused on ZEB. Just in case you don't know, Oregon is on the northwestern part of the United States, and it's really far from Trondheim and from Norway. And so this was a little bit difficult because with Tina being in Norway a lot of the time, and we were doing a lot of communication back and forth, but we managed to kind of to work out an arrangement that worked for both of us. So the first time I ever talked with Tina, it was on Skype. I remember this clearly. And she said to me, do you know anything about ZEB, the ZEB Center or the ZEB concept? And I said, no, tell me about it. So she gave me a pretty good explanation. And she said, do you think that this is something that an intermediate level design studio could do? And I said, I don't know, maybe. It was ambitious, for sure. And the reason, I think, is because some of the ideas that you've all been talking about today are very much things that are being talked about in the United States. But some of the ideas you've been talking about are quite new and quite rare in the United States. Things like zero-energy buildings, we talk about that a lot now. Things like plus buildings, we talk about those things. We talk about carbon neutrality. We talk about things like embodied energy. We talk about global climate change. We talk about these things. But when we start talking about things like embodied emissions of building materials and how we can start to account for that in buildings, that's not something that we talk a whole lot about in the US. And we specifically do not talk about that a lot in design studios with students who don't have a lot of technical experience. So this was a little bit of a risk. Luckily, we had some good precedents. One of the precedents was a project that Tina, I think at the time, was just finishing up. And it was just about the right scale. We thought we needed a project that students could work on that was small enough that they could really kind of wrap their head around it in a relatively short period of time. So a residential application was a good scale for us. And we had a good precedent. And the precedent, I think, was important because we could use the precedent as a way of helping students understand the process. How do you think about designing this kind of a building? What are some of the problems that you might encounter? And can the precedent help to solve or answer some of the questions that arise in that kind of process? So we use this as a precedent. Now, one of the things that's challenging, and we encountered this a little bit as time went on, is that This precedent in particular is a very good precedent. I think it showed our students a lot of really interesting ways of thinking about ZEB, but our project was not in Norway. And so a lot of the conditions that we were dealing with in the project that we were doing in Oregon were quite different. And so, in some ways that's a good thing, and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because I think it's very good for students to start to think about climate responsive design. We talked about that here at this conference earlier today and the importance of that. And I think one of the things that the students started to notice is that the way that the buildings that they were designing as part of their design studio projects responded to the local climate in Oregon, where we were designing these buildings, was quite different maybe than the way that the Larvik House was responding to climate. And so it was kind of a good and a bad thing. One of the things is that we had a very, very short period of time. 10 weeks, that's a very short period of time for students to get to the level of detail we were asking them to. And so we decided right from the very beginning, we're going to have them work in teams. And actually that worked for two reasons. One was, it was really important, I think, for us to have students work in a situation where we were trying to simulate the kinds of integrated ways of working that these kinds of ZEB projects rely on. And so the students, we sort of carefully calibrated these teams so that the students had the right kind of skills within the teams, and they worked within these teams for the remainder of the semester. And the teams were quite successful. It's just a couple of illustrations of kind of the types of teamwork that they were doing. One of the things that was very exciting was that they were very excited about this process and about some of the ideas that we were talking about, and almost all of the work that they did was together, sitting around the table, figuring things out together on blackboards, even using kind of low-tech kind of tools to communicate some of their ideas with one another. One of the things that was really important to the ZEB projects that Tina had worked on was this idea of regular kinds of workshops that happen at intervals where the entire team of specialists that are working on these projects kind of get together and really kind of talk about ideas and talk about kind of a path forward. Obviously, in a design studio setting, we don't have a large team of specialists. Right? We have a small group of students. The students can take on different roles, but we don't necessarily have those specialists. And so what we did is we tried the best that we could to kind of bring people in that could speak to some of these kind of specialty kinds of concerns. You might recognize a few of these people. There's Lucas talking, I think, about energy modeling, and Tina sitting at the table, and Anna Greta there. That was really a highlight, I think, for us to actually have some folks from NTNU and ZEB come to Oregon, long distance, to actually talk with the students about the process. One of the major aspects of the project for the students was to design this house to meet a very kind of specific performance target. This idea of designing in a design studio setting buildings that are striving to kind of reach a performance target, this is not necessarily that uncommon in the US right now. I wouldn't say that it's common, but it's not uncommon. But I think that there's some challenges associated with that, and there are tools that the students really need to have at their disposal to be able to make that happen. One of the challenges, I think, with the kinds of tools that students really need to design projects that approximate the sort of, the performance targets that we're aiming at, is that they don't necessarily have a lot of specialized skill. Right? They don't necessarily have energy modeling skill or climate analysis skills. And so the kinds of skills that they need to be able to answer some of the questions that arise in their design project are things that they need to develop these skills very quickly. And so we needed to find tools that were very easy to use, cost effective, and that they could get good information right from the very beginning. So these weren't necessarily the most elaborate or the most robust kinds of tools that the students were using, but they were tools that the students had at their disposal that I think were useful. Just some examples of the kind of tools we used. We used energy modeling software like Saphira. Saphira is very useful because it can be integrated. It works as a plugin with software students already know, and they can get kind of real-time feedback on some of the decisions that they're making. There are other softwares like this. We can do things like have students look at daylighting conditions. And the students are starting, the benefit of this is that real-time students are really starting to kind of talk about making changes or making decisions in their design process that really respond to the data that they're finding. Using really kind of simple online tools in the United States, a very popular one is called PB Watts. The students were using this and they were kind of going back and forth and changing the configuration of roofs and the areas of the roofs and the pitches of the roofs to try to figure out how they could get the best solar yield. It was really kind of exciting to see that the students were really trying to reconcile some of their design ideas and some of the performance goals. And then climate analysis tools like Climate Consultant that allowed us to get very detailed information about our particular location and helped students to understand things like wind patterns and other kinds of climate patterns in that area. Obviously, the material aspect was important to us because our sort of precedent project was very in Larvik was very much kind of involved, this idea of really kind of accounting for building materials. We wanted students to do this as well. Now, the problem is that there's really not a lot of information, or there wasn't a lot of information for us in such a short period of time. And so it was difficult for the students really to find the kind of information that they needed that worked with the kinds of design ideas that they had. And this was probably the biggest challenge that we had. I think, if there was, maybe in the future there will be other kinds of information available, a little bit more available for students that will make this a little bit easier. But for us, this was really challenging. I think they embraced the idea of trying to account for embodied emissions of materials. It's simply difficult to do that in such a short period of time. But we still wanted, we still went through this process, so it was really interesting to see students really carefully choosing materials and trying to choose materials that were natural materials, materials that, had low embodied carbon emissions kind of profiles. And ultimately, I think what we ended up doing was, having students looking at a select number of materials and really trying to understand a select number of materials and then being able to apply some assumptions to other kinds of materials that maybe the students didn't have a chance to get to in their designs. But I think even the idea that we incorporated this aspect into the project was quite new to the students. It was certainly quite new to the university, and it was really kind of an eye-opening experience for both of us. And I'm just going to show you just a couple of examples. I'm just going to flip through a couple of examples of some of the outcomes of the projects. I'm not going to talk in a whole lot of detail about all the projects. But one of the things that was really kind of impressive is that after all of the work that the students did, there were some really compelling graphics that the students generated, and some really kind of sensitive responses to, to the climate, to the location, to issues of occupant needs, et cetera. And so I'm just going to flip through a few of these. Real sensitivity to kind of local materials. The northwest of the United States is has a lot of plentiful kind of wood products. Sensitivity to orientation, et cetera. Really kind of looking at the quality of spaces indoors and trying to approximate what that might be like. Kind of thinking about the whole site, right? So not just sort of the building itself, but sort of how the users may kind of interact with different aspects of the site. In this case, this was some ideas about how to have local food production on the particular site and how the building actually kind of frames some of those spaces. And I think one of the things that was really interesting was we really wanted the students to think about incorporating outdoor spaces. The climate is quite mild in Oregon, and so there's a real opportunity for us to extend the kind of indoor space with some outdoor spaces that are maybe framed by the building. And so this was kind of some explorations that the students were doing with how do you integrate those kinds of spaces into the architecture, trying different kinds of strategies. And then just a couple of recommendations. I wanted to kind of end with a few. for you. And I certainly hope that this isn't the last project that I do that with students that involve Zeb principles and the Zeb concept. I've been telling people about this for a couple of years now. But I think one of the things that we were nervous about at the very beginning was this idea that perhaps this was too ambitious, right? To ask students to maybe take this on, maybe too ambitious. It was a risk. It was kind of a risk to do this in such a short period of time. But I think what we found in the end was that really when we set the bar quite high, the students really rose to the occasion, and I think that actually got them maybe even more excited about the project. I think that some of the logistical things that we worked out were quite useful. The workshops, really having students kind of come together, bringing in outside people. We're bringing outside people in is not necessarily the easiest thing because of cost and time, etc. You can do it remotely via Skype and other kinds of tools. Precedents, detailed precedents are good. It's difficult sometimes to find very detailed precedents. And I think that that's something, in the design industries, we really need to share detailed information more so that students have access to the kind of information that will help them in their design processes. Having the students really think about who the users might be in these projects was quite important. And I think that they were able to kind of paint a picture for us of what the experience would be like. This wasn't just sort of like a random house that would be built anywhere. It was really kind of a house that was tailored towards meeting certain kinds of needs of certain kinds of users. And I think, having that kind of big picture goal, so in our case, we had certain big picture goals that were sort of tied to Zeb, I think was helpful. But I think it's important not to lose touch of the real kind of detail-oriented things too. So kind of the big picture goals, but also sort of the detail-oriented things as well. This was certainly not a project that was without a lot of help. So this is just some acknowledgments of the people that were involved with this process. It takes a lot of people to do this kind of thing in a short period of time. And I'm certainly happy to answer any questions via email or after the sessions if anybody would like to talk more about it. Thank you very much.
Up.